Your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to 1 Timothy. We're going to continue on our series that we started kind of at the beginning of the summer, as we're going to walk through this book and just talk about some of the different things that Paul is telling to Timothy. If you're new here to us this morning, just give a quick overview. This book is written to Timothy as part of the pastoral epistles that we see in 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. These are letters that were written to pastors in the church, not specifically churches, but to pastors in the church. And the idea was this, is that they would understand how to govern their church. How would you run your church? And matter of fact, we see that in 1 Timothy chapter 3, in verse 14, starts there, it says, although I hope to come to you soon, this is what Paul writes to Timothy. I'm writing to you these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth. And so Paul writes this to him and said, look, this is for your benefit. This is for you as you lead your church, as you lead your people. This is so that people will know how to act. And so we deal with, in the first couple of chapters here, we deal with what grace looks like. We deal with what prayer looks like. We deal with who we should pray for. We deal with instructions on worship and who should be leading and what category they should be leading in. And so it's this idea that Paul is kind of giving you the bylaws of the church in 1 Timothy. And he's kind of just laying them out for you. Here are the criteria that you should look for. Here's what you should be doing. And we get through all of that stuff in the first 4 chapters. And it looks just like that. I mean, if you kind of sit back a little bit, it looks like somebody could write the bylaws of their church, often as many churches do. But he gets into chapter 5, and let me just preface this by saying, have you ever taught a lesson, or you ever gotten ready to do something, and you know, I'm about to teach something, and the person that needs to hear this the most is me? I'm getting ready to learn something, and the person that needs to learn it the most is me, because that's where I am. I need to preface this message by saying, I'm going to talk about some things this morning that I think are the right things to do. I think they're the way that God wants us to do things, and I'll back it all up with Scripture. But here's the thing. I want you to know, but I teach this from a standpoint of, as I teach this, there are things in my life that I'm still working on. There are things in my family that I'm still working on. This is not one of those messages where I want you to think, man, the pastor's got it all together and he's up there telling us how to get it done. No. The pastor has an idea about what it should look like, but he's still working toward it. And I want to preface that message this morning with that, because I don't want anybody to think that my family has got it together, because here's what happens. One of the passions of my life is the family. And because God has created us and given us each other, and there's the nucleus of the family that is so important. And it's so dear to me. I want to make sure that I got this because I grew up in a large family. I had four older brothers and sisters. I had a mom and dad who were amazing, right? They still are amazing. My mom's still amazing. I grew up in a great family. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, I always thought to myself, I want a large family. I want a family of 5. And then, and some of you maybe heard me tell this before, but we got married and we had 1 kid. I was like, maybe not 5, you know. and then we had 2, and I was like, I think I'm done at 2. And then my wife goes, well, we're pregnant. I'm like, okay. And so, Jake, I'm glad you're here this morning. But here's the thing. I love family. I love my family passionately, and I think family is so important, and we need to do everything we can, listen, church, to guard our family, to guard what God has entrusted to us. And I think Paul speaks specifically to this. Let me go ahead and skip down to chapter 5, verse 8, and I want you to see this morning. This is how passionately I think Paul talks about this, and we'll deal with this next week. We'll spend a couple of weeks on this, but Paul says this to Timothy because if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You don't think Paul has something to say about family? He does. And he starts this chapter off with these 2 particular verses, and he says this, do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your, what's the word? Father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as with absolute purity. Guys, here's the deal. Paul's starting off advice about widows and elders and this and slaves here in this particular passage. And he says, look, you treat them like you would treat your own family. So as I got ready to kind of dive into that, I thought to myself, there's no way in the world that I can teach on those particular two verses the way that I want to and not first establish what a healthy family looks like. What does God lay out for us in Scripture as to what a healthy family should look like? Because here's what I know. That in a congregation this size this morning, a room filled with this many people, there are some people who are struggling in their families. There are people who are going through it. There are people whose families have broken apart for one reason or another. There are people in here whose families are going through a tough time of tribulation right now, and you're wondering if you're going to make it. You're wondering if your grandkids are going to make it. You're wondering if your brothers or sisters are going to make it because there's no health in their family whatsoever. It is impossible for us to be able to correct an older man in our life correctly if we don't know how to treat a father. It's impossible for us to talk to a lady in our life who needs help if we don't know how to properly talk to a mom. It's impossible for us if we've never had siblings to know how to treat a sister or treat a brother. But it's certainly impossible if we've had one and that relationship's not healthy to begin with. And so this morning what I want us to do is I want us to look at what does our family look like and what should a family look like. Because I believe it's incredibly important. And the first thing that I think as I have studied this, as I have looked at this in my own life, and as I have looked at this over the course of counseling people in ministry over the years, the first thing I think you must have in order for your family to be healthy is a unity in faith. Colossians 3, chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. We don't have time to read through all of them, but I put that out there for you because I want you to go look that up later on. If you want to look at what attributes or characteristics or principles that a family should look like, go and look at that particular piece of Scripture. It is a piece of Scripture that gives us a very clear idea of what families should look like. And it starts in just the first couple of verses, and it says this: since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above. There can be no unity, and listen to what I'm about to say. There can be no unity of faith in the family that does not first begin in the marriage. Let me say that again. If you are raising a family, if God has given you a husband and wife, you're all together, your family, that's your family. It begins right there. If God has blessed you with kids and has given you kids, then the direction of that family starts in that marriage. And that the reason is that the idea is this, is that y'all got to be headed in the same direction. I can't tell you how many times that I have sat and I've counseled with people who are about to get married, and they come into my office and they sit down, and one of the very first things that I try to establish is what their walk with Jesus is. And there have been times where I have counseled people that you need to postpone your wedding, or you need to postpone this engagement until you first figure out what a relationship with Jesus Christ looks like. Because in my mind, and this is just my opinion, and you may or may not agree with me, but in my mind, marriage is a creation of God. And it should not be entered into unless you first know the love of God Himself through His Son, Jesus Christ, because you are setting yourself up for failure. So the direction of unity and faith in your family ought to be the direction of Jesus. Not just any Jesus, but the Jesus of the Bible, right? The Jesus of the Bible. It's not a denomination. There are I'm not sure if you know this, there are denominations out there that don't look at Jesus the same way. There are churches out there that don't look at Jesus the same way that we do. And I'm not trying to get into this denomination or this church or whatever the case is this morning. Just know that there are people that think of Jesus differently than what the Jesus of the Bible is, right? And they don't look at Him the same way. And the unity of faith doesn't come from an ideology that changes with time and culture. It doesn't do that. A unity of faith is driving your family and leading your family to raise them to look more like the Jesus of the Bible every single day. And every day won't be perfect. Trust me. Every day will not be perfect. Some days will be better than others, but you don't stop moving your family in that direction. You've got to make sure you're moving in that direction. And you have to help them to understand that there are things in this world that break God's heart. There are things in this world that when you do them, when you say them, when you act them out, those are things that go against everything that God is, His character, the principles that He teaches us. And we've got to show our family what that looks like. And then it starts with us. Because all of those things that break God's heart are happening in our own lives. And if we're not humble enough or understanding of ourselves enough to be able to acknowledge that to our kiddos, to acknowledge that to our spouse, to be able to go to our spouse and say, you know what, I messed up here today. I said something I probably shouldn't have said. I did something I probably shouldn't have done. And that broke God's heart. And I need you to forgive me for that. I need you to deal with me for that. Our kids need to see that in us. When we have messed up, they need to see that we are willing to acknowledge that we have broken God's heart. Because when our kids can see that we understand that it breaks God's heart, it helps them as they continue to make life decisions and to do the things that they want to do in order to look more like God every single day. We need to help our family see the importance of characteristics like, and then we see it in Colossians, but characteristics like patience and compassion and kindness and gentleness and forgiveness. Those are rare because, have you ever just driven with somebody? Right? The most uncompassionate, most unforgiving, most impatient people in the world are behind steering wheels of cars. They are. And I'm one of them. I called a guy an idiot the other day in the road. Look, they didn't get all the way over the turn lane. Everybody else had to stop and slam their brakes on behind them. I get it. I'm one of those people. We are very incompassionate. We're very impatient. And we don't have a whole lot of kindness to us when behind the driver's wheel of a car. What does that look like in other places of our life? Because it's not just there. And we need to make sure that we are showing that kind of character in our lives as we lead our families. As we lead our families, moms, dads, grandparents, that's what it should look like. Our children should see that in us. We should model that for them. And more than any of those things, compassion and kindness and everything else, our family ought to see within us love. Now, not just any kind of love. This is the agape love that we're talking about. And it's this idea of love that says, I am going to look at your best interest regardless of the circumstances. I'm going to do what is best for you regardless of how you've treated me. I'm going to do what's best for you however I can. That means sometimes, as students, I want you to hear this, sometimes your parents need to let you hang out to dry for a little bit. They need to let you mess up on your own so that you learn some good, hard life lessons. I don't think enough of that takes place anymore. I remember when I was a kid growing up, some kids had in the neighborhood had taken my two older brothers' bikes. And they were older kids than my brothers, and my brothers came screaming into the house, and they shut the door behind them. They were all upset, and my dad was standing at the top of the stairs, and he goes, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Those kids down there took our bikes, so they won't let us have them back." And my dad walked down the stairs. He walked them back outside, and he closed the doors behind them, and he says, "Don't you come back until you get your bikes." Now, it would have been easy for my dad to walk down there and have a parent conversation with the other parent or have a parent conversation with the two kids in the neighborhood. But no. What he did is he shoved my brothers out the door, which I'm thankful it wasn't me. He told my brothers, "Don't you come back here without your bikes." And you know what? They got their bikes. He allowed them to learn a lesson about dealing with conflict. We'll talk about that in just a little bit more. But we've got to give our kids the opportunity to learn and not always take put a pillow underneath them so that they don't hurt themselves when they fall. We got to love them, but sometimes we can do more harm than good by taking the responsibilities away from them. We got to give them an opportunity to learn. It means instilling discipline in their lives. And in order for us to instill discipline in the lives of our family, we have to have discipline in our own life. We've got to make that happen. When we speak lessons, if we don't live those lessons out, they're just useless words. And we don't want that at all in our life. There was a study done by the Institute of Family Studies back in 2021, it said Christians who go to church on a regular basis, meaning 3 to 4 times a month, are far more likely, first of all, to get married. And they are less likely to divorce than the rest of the general population. There is something about having a unity of faith in a family. And I want you to go a step further with me. I want you to think about the families of today. My family that I've been leading is different than the family that my father and my mother led. And some of the younger families underneath me are even worse than we are. And here's the thing. We didn't have just a ton of things taking up our time. We didn't have anything like year-round sports. We didn't have dance, and we didn't have all these different things. You played Summer League baseball. You played 12 games. And then you made All-Stars, and then you were finished, and then you played Pee Wee football, and Pee Wee football had 8 or 9 games. And then once it was over, you did Little League basketball, and that's it. You didn't play sports year-round. You didn't have the strains of multiple sports being played at one time. You didn't have the strains of making academic stuff all the time. You didn't have the strain of having to keep up with social media, having to keep up with all the family vacations that everybody else is having, and you're trying to do the same thing. Families are pulled in a lot of different directions. We didn't, the older generation in here didn't even have to worry about a 2-income family because 1 income was enough. So one parent was able to stay at home. We have an economy now that doesn't allow that. And so we got parents moving in both directions with career-oriented parents who are trying to do their thing and kids that we want to keep active all the time. And there's always something going on. And we can very easily get to a point where the family's going in a million different directions and nobody is following after Christ. And we've got to get to a place in our families where we are actively pursuing Jesus in every decision that we make, regardless of whether it's dance, sports, academics, or anything else. It's got to be Jesus first. Period. And if it's not that, then there is no unity of faith in your family. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is this, and it's mature communication. I understand this. If there's no unity of faith, mature communication becomes very difficult, right? Very difficult, because the Bible tells us in James that we need to be quick to listen and slow to respond. Paul tells us in Colossians that when you do respond, that it should be full of grace and seasoned with salt, meaning that salt makes things taste better. And it also preserves them. Can you imagine having conversations where the things that you're saying just come across better? They come across easier. They're nice to hear. They may hurt, but they're still nice to hear. And you preserve a relationship in the meanwhile. That we need to be seasoned with salt and full of grace. Paul says in Ephesians that our words should be wholesome and encouraging. Right? That's the way our words should be. And then he says in Galatians that we should gently restore those who do wrong. Now, this is talking about conflict. And understand this. Most people want to avoid conflict. I'm not necessarily a conflict denier. I like conflict. I think it kind of energizes me a little bit in my life. I go looking for it necessarily. I don't necessarily enjoy it, but I am not afraid of it, right? There are a lot of people who are very afraid of conflict. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. They don't want to feel uneasy. But let me say this, and I think this is a true statement. Great relationships, listen to me, great relationships have healthy conflict. I'm going to say that one more time. Great relationships have healthy conflict. Think of your wife or your husband in this room this morning. You've made a commitment to them, and you have lived years with them. Maybe weeks that feel like years. I don't know. But you've lived years with them. You mean to tell me you've never had conflict? Yes, you've had conflict. You know why your relationship is so special? It's because you have figured out how to have conflict in that relationship and still be okay with one another. My wife and I sat down when we first got married, and we said, hey, there's some rules. There's just going to be some rules. Where conflict is concerned, we're just going to say this. We may be mad at each other, and we may be angry, and I might say something really, really not smart, right? But there's no leaving. You're not allowed to walk out the door. If we fight, you can't leave the house. You can go to another room. We may even go to bed angry, right? And I know that that's not biblical. I get it. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. There have been nights where we have gone to bed angry, and the reason that we know we're angry is because our feet don't touch, right? If our feet are touching, we're okay in the relationship. If the feet are not touching, we got to deal with some stuff in the morning before we get going with anything else. But there's rules, right? You can't leave. And the reason you can't leave is because when you leave, what you're doing is you're practicing leaving. And at some point, when you practice it enough, it's going to just get easier and easier to do, to the point where one day you don't come back. And that's not okay. You've got to be able to deal with conflict and handle conflict in such a way that it builds the family up and helps make good relationships great. Does that make sense? Now, there are several different ways of dealing with conflicts. Here's what I did. I talked to people who I thought were smarter than me, and there's a lot of them out there. And I said, hey, look, when you are dealing with people who are hurting and you know that you have to correct them in some way, if I were the one that was having to correct an older person, or if I'm the one who's having to correct a member of my family, how would you teach me to do this? Now, mind you, I'm not talking to somebody my own age. I'm talking to somebody 10, 20, 30 years my elder. And here is the things that I was told. And I thought it was great advice. First thing is this. First, you have to consider your role. You have to consider your role first. Within this conflict that has taken place, what did you do? And you say, well, just probably not anything. That's false. You had something to do with it. It might not have been the negative part of the conflict, but you had a part of the conflict. You have got to get to the point where you recognize what your role is in whatever conflict you're dealing with was, and you begin to deal with that first. When I counsel people, and I learned this from somebody else, but when I counsel people who are married and they're dealing with relationship issues in their life, I draw a circle on a piece of paper, and I say, all right, I slide it over to them. I say, I want you to fill in the graph. Make a little pie chart for me of how much, if this is 100% of the conflict, how much of the conflict are you responsible for? And in doing that, most of the time, the one that's talking the most will fill in something like 20% or 10%. And I'll bring that back and I'll say, all right, then here's the deal. I only want to deal with that 10%. Because here's the thing. You can't fix the other person, but you can fix you. And so as we deal with the conflict here this morning, I want to deal only with the conflict that you have brought, the decisions that you have made in order to make this happen. And I want us to see how we can fix it, because only you can fix you. You can't fix the other person, right? And so we have to understand our role first. Second thing is this. We need to make sure that we have their best interest at heart. We need to make sure that we are not coming into a situation where we're coming in to try and ridicule them or tear them down. That cannot be the point of conflict. We're not looking to make people feel bad about themselves. We're looking to correct an issue. It's not personal, right? It's not personal. We don't want to tear them apart. We want to fix things going forward. We want to look out for their best interest. Again, that's what love looks like, regardless of the circumstances. Next thing is this. We want to make sure that we correct in private and honor confidentiality. Correct in private and honor confidentiality. People are far less likely to react poorly when they don't feel ganged up on. Guys, if I've got a conflict with you, I'm not bringing my friends to help me with that conflict. I'm coming to you, man to woman, man to young man or young woman, face to face, knee to knee, and I'm saying, here's what's going on. This is how I feel. This is what I think my role in this was. How do we fix this going forward? There's got to be a healthy conflict resolution in order for great relationships to happen. Next thing is this. We have to remember that when we're dealing with conflict, that it's a teaching moment, and it's not about who's right or wrong. If we go into a conversation of dealing with conflict and we're only worried about who's right and who's wrong in the conflict, we're addressing it from the completely wrong angle to begin with, right? A couple weeks ago, I said, remember, if you're asking the question, how much can I drink before it's a sin, you probably don't need to be drinking if that's your attitude toward it, right? Same thing is true here. If I'm going into a conflict and trying to resolve that conflict with the idea of establishing who was right and who was wrong, I probably need to step back and take a few more times of prayer before I address the conflict, because I'm addressing it from the completely wrong angle to begin with. And so we need to make sure it's not about who's right or wrong. It's about making sure that we get the action corrected going forward. Next thing is this: be respectful in your tone and your attitude. Teenagers, be respectful in your tone and your attitude. Parents, be respectful in your tone and your attitude, because the way that you speak to somebody says a lot about the way that you truly feel about them. Be respectful. They are God's creation. They are to be loved. Love them by the way that you speak to them. Next one is this: listen to understand and not to respond. Listen to understand and not to respond. Men, we need to get better at this. Sometimes we listen so that we can fix. And one of the things that I've learned in the 26 years of marriage is a lot of times my wife just needs me to listen and not try to fix anything at all. We need to listen to understand and not to respond. The last one is this: finally, place yourself in their position. Place yourself in their position. Understand you don't know the circumstances that they're dealing with. You have no idea what a person is going through. You have no idea that they may just be hanging on by a thread right now because of what's going on in their life. And this conflict that you're having to deal with them on is just one more thing. Try and place yourself in their position. Get to understand what they're going through. Not everybody's just an evil person out to get to you, right? Your waiter did not fill up your glass because they didn't like you. They may have some other things going on, right? So we don't want to blurt out and just tear them apart and ridicule them because of it. We need to put ourselves in their position and try to understand things from their viewpoint. And so that'll help us when we figure out how to approach them, and it'll help us on figuring out what realistic expectations are. I was with the VBS this past week, and we had a bunch of different age kids all the way from 5th grade down to, I don't know, it felt like, nursery. But it wasn't. But on Thursday, I was sharing the gospel story. I was sharing Jesus with every one of these classes. And these kids, they're just eager to learn. And when I would get them in the class, I would get them to me. They were spread out all over the floor, and I would pull them in a little bit closer. And the younger they were, the closer I wanted them to me. And the reason for that is because when you love somebody and you're trying to get them to understand something, the closer in proximity they are to you, the more they're going to listen, and the less likely they are to go and do something else. And I understood that about them. But here's what I understood more than anything else. 6-year-old kids are going to act like 6-year-old kids. And if we expect a 6-year-old kid to act like a 15-year-old kid, then our expectations are not setting us up to have a successful conversation. If you are expecting a 25-year-old son who's going through some stuff and might not even be following Jesus to act like a 50-year-old man who's been following Jesus his whole life, you are setting unrealistic expectations in the conversation of that conflict. And you need to set realistic expectations that are going to help you to have a good resolving of this conflict for a great relationship to move forward. Does that make sense? Moves us to the next thing. Okay, so the unity in faith, we have mature communication, and then the last one to me is this, is a relentless commitment. A relentless commitment. And I've got to hurry up, but we don't have much time. But Proverbs 16:3 tells us that whatever you do, commit it to the Lord. Whatever you do, commit it to your Lord, and your plans will succeed. Not succeed in hey, if I give more money, God will give me more money. It's not that idea. Success in God's eyes is different than what our culture deems success is. I commit my family to God, and I will have a strong family. I will have a strong family even in the midst of my difficulties, in the midst of my disagreements, in the midst of my blow-ups, in the midst of the tragedies that are going to come upon my family. What sets a healthy family apart is the commitment to make one another, the commitment that you make to one another, that you don't give up on each other in the midst of all of those things. It's easy to look at situations and it's easy to look at people when you're in the middle of a tragedy, when you're in the middle of an argument or some disagreement, and say, you know what, I'm out the door. It's easy because you can, this is the kind of commitment I'm talking about that says, I'm going to still love my spouse and I'm going to still love my children, I'm going to still love my parents, regardless of the list of reasons that I could come up with not to. That's the human perspective. That's the commitment we're looking for. But let me take it a step further and say the Christian commitment to family is that there are certain decisions that are made far in advance of difficult circumstances. If I stand before God and my friends with my wife, wife to be, and I make a commitment to them, what I am saying is I've made the commitment to stay with you regardless of the circumstances that are coming. I'm not making a commitment until it's not convenient for me anymore. I'm making a commitment for life regardless of all the stuff that we're going to go through. There are decisions as Christians that are made long before they ever come into place. It means I'll honor Christ whatever the pain and whatever the cost, even when it's the hardest thing for me to do. And I will do what God has called me to do when it's draining as well as fulfilling. Look, I said it a while ago and I'll say it again. Marriage vows are based off of this process. And it's this. Whenever I do a wedding, before I ever allow the dad to give the bride away, I have them all stand in front of me, and I remind them of the story in Genesis where he put Adam in the garden, and he says, I want you to name all the animals. I want you to find a suitable helper. And Adam does all of that, and he goes to God, and he says, I can't find a suitable helper. There's not one. He goes, you're right. So he caused Adam to fall asleep, and in the midst of his sleep, he took a rib, he created woman, and then while Adam is waking up, coming out of that groggy, hard day's work of naming animals, elephant, we get it. He's waking up, he's groggy, and he looks and he sees God bringing this incredible creation to him. And it's these verses that we say in the Christian faith that God created marriage at this moment. And I say to the bride and to the groom when they're standing in front of me, first, do you believe that God has brought the two of you together? And the answer should be yes. And if that's the case, then the Bible tells us what God has brought together, let no man separate. There's a commitment level there that regardless of everything else that's going to happen, we are going to put Christ first, we are going to put our spouse next, and we are going to lead our children to Christ because there's going to be a unity in faith. And within that unity of faith, there's going to be mature communication, and we are going to learn how to be relentlessly committed to one another. Let me finish off with saying this. In my family, on my side of the family alone, I have a mom, I have 4 siblings. Each one of those siblings and myself are all married. We all have kids, which gives us 26 nieces and nephews, and my own children and their spouse. My mom has 8 great-great-grandchildren, which gives us a total of about 45 people. On my wife's side of the family, there's her mom and dad, her 2 siblings, both of them married, 10 nieces and nephews, and our own children with their spouse. 6 great-great-grandchildren for a total of 24. So our entire family numbers about 64 people. If we were to all get together for a big Bryant and Cox family reunion, we're not. But if we were, we're looking at about 64 people. Now understand this. Look at the opportunity alone for the possibility of disagreements, political disagreements, parenting differences, denominational differences. Guys, if it's about all of those things, you're going to have a fractured family. But when it becomes about Jesus and Him alone, and everything in your family filters down through Jesus first, there is a unity of faith that can take place, and spiritual unity happens, and mature communication can take place, and Christ-like commitment happens. And that's what we're looking for when He says, look, don't rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father, and treat younger men as brothers, and older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Guys, we have to have a healthy family because God has put you in your family. And it's our job to lead our families well so that when we deal with our church family, it looks the same. You might not know what a healthy father looks like, but I can tell you where one is within the pages of this book. And if you don't know what a relationship with Him looks like, and you need to know what a healthy family looks like, it's in the pages of this book. And I don't want to guilt you into anything, and I don't want to convince you of anything. I just want to tell you, if you've been looking, if your family's struggling, if you're struggling individually, it's in the pages of this book that we see the character of a God that loves us so passionately that He gave you the family that you have. And He said, now do something with it. and do something with it that glorifies who I am. Guys, as Christians, we got to start there. It's impossible for us to do missions to anybody else if we can't take care of our own family, right?